evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's fifth in-person America's Public Forum event held by the Braver Angels D.C. project here in Washington, D.C. In the year 2023. We are recording from our standard go-to location in the loft at the Hamilton, and I am joined tonight by two thinkers and activists I respect quite a bit for qualities of mind and character, and I'm eager to move into a little conversation on some things about the status and future of the American left with them over the next hour and a half here. But to start off, let me just introduce the program to you and the organization that is running this. So this is an event hosted by Braver Angels. Braver Angels is the nation's largest grassroots-led, fully red-blue civic association dedicated to helping Americans find value in each other across all of their political, cultural, and social divides, but most specifically and most importantly, across the red-blue divide that shapes and frames so much of politics these days. We do that in a variety of ways. We do a lot of different kinds of workshops. We do a lot of different kinds of debates. We do other sorts of training programs. And the vast majority of our work takes place at a grassroots level outside of Washington, D.C. In fact, the reason why my little chunk of the organization is called the Braver Angels D.C. project is because we need a very slight little embassy to work in D.C., and that's kind of what I run down here. Now, the Braver Angels D.C. project has specifically been engaging intellectuals and policy operatives all across the political spectrum in a variety of ways. We do a closed-door debate series with young professionals. Those of you who've been in it, you know what I'm talking about. Those of you who have not been in it yet, I would be excited to invite you to come to those soon. But we also host these America's Public Forum events, and these America's Public Forum events are more or less our effort to do the most DC style of DC event in a way that brings the best of the spirits we tried to bring out and some of the best ways of thinking about the pressing issues of our time and of all times from really talented thinkers who are working on these issues in their own times. So that's what the APF is. Those of you who've been following us a while might have remembered an event we did in March called Social Visions and Political Economies Emerging on the Right with Sam Hamid and Chris Griswold. You should look at this as something of a counterpart to that event, Social Visions and Political Economies Emerging on the Left with Shadi, Hamid, and Pete Davis. And what we are going to talk about today is the different trends and different ways that activists and intellectual movements and sometimes party organizations, sometimes candidates, but most specifically just the broad social bases and intellectual understandings of what politics looks like on the contemporary 2010s and 2020s American left. We're going to talk about what that looks like on a couple of different fronts here. I myself am not of the left. I myself am of the right. And I cut my teeth before Braver Angels and inside Braver Angels thinking about what's the best kind of conservative? How can I be the best possible kind of conservative? And Braver Angels a long time ago helped me to think a little bit more clearly about the falseness of the friend-enemy divide in some of those sorts of questions. It also helped me to take a look a little bit over the aisle and see that there are folks operating in different corners of the American left struggling with some of the same questions of consensus versus coalition, power versus freedom, and order versus spontaneity that my fellow right-wing thinkers do. And I'm joined tonight by two folks who spend a lot of time both in the dirt on the ground and in the air, in the chambers of thought, thinking about what order and what politics and what the future of ways to think about politics looks like in the vast spectrum that is the American left. So let me just introduce our two speakers here tonight real quick. We are joined first off by Shadi Hamid. Shadi Hamid is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He writes frequently for a number of publications. One of the ones most frequently there is The Atlantic magazine, and we might actually mention a few of your pieces on polarization back here too. And he also is, remind me, the editor of Wisdom of Crowds?
Yeah.
He's the editor of a fascinating little project called The Wisdom of Crowds. It's an excellent podcast / newsletter / site for originally produced essays that engages in questions of fundamental political theory on an ongoing level. And of all the newsletters that come into my inbox every day, I think that's one of like maybe 3 or 4 that I will click on every single one that shows up. Shadi, Hamid, welcome to Braver Angels.
Thank you.
We're also joined by Pete Davis of the Democracy Policy Network. Pete was one of the founders of the Democracy Policy Network, which does work with a variety of civic organizations around the country, but especially here in the Washington, D.C. metro area and Northern Virginia, to advance various progressive and communitarian left causes and understandings of civic action in the name of democracy and various things. He writes at a variety of publications. One of them was Current Affairs, and actually I first discovered some of his writings over at Current Affairs and New Left Review. And if you're familiar with publishing on the left, Current Affairs and New Left Review are pretty interesting places to be. And the really good stuff in them is really good, and Pete's doing some of that. So Pete comes to us from that side of things. Also, I should mention that in the back, we have 2 QR codes for 2 different books. One of those books is by Pete. It's called Dedicated, The Case for Commitment in an Age of
Infinite browsing.
In an age of infinite browsing. As a fan of infinite
you don't
browsing.
need to memorize the subtitle.
And Shadi, we have Shadi's book as well, which is remind me,
The Problem of Democracy.
The Problem of Democracy. The Problem of Democracy in America, the Middle East, and the Death of an Idea.
The Rise and Fall of an Idea.
And the rise and fall of an idea. Not quite the death yet. So, but that's why we're here, is to go through it and see if we can preserve that life onward into many things. So Pete, welcome. Shadi, welcome. Welcome you both to Braver Angels. So again, this event, we're going to be just having a conversation on various trends on the left. And I will pose a preliminary question for both of you that you can take as narrowly or as broadly as you like. We're going to talk about it for a couple minutes here, and then we will open things up to audience Q&A, and we will go through things from there. But what is the future of the American left? How should we be thinking about the most important philosophical divisions in the American left? How have those evolved over time? And what are the most compelling questions that the different factions and different movements in the American left in the 2020s need to answer? Pete, let's start with you.
Well, first off, thank you all for coming. You know, you could be doing anything on a Tuesday night. There are amazing Hulu and Netflix documentaries that just dropped. Jewish Matchmaking, the Dunkers documentary, all of these wonderful ones, and you've decided to come here and nerd out on like political theory and the future of the left with this. I'm so glad you came out. Luke, thank you so much, and I appreciate your patience in me being late. I have a 1-year-old that's just learning to walk, and I'm flying around to tour a documentary, and I was just in San Francisco with my 1-year-old, and we got into Dulles at like exactly the amount of time that I needed to get here, exactly at the time I got here. So I appreciate that. I have 4 different things I'd like to put on the table. I'll take a minute each on each of them, just about what I think about the future of the left and the future of the Dems. So one area is institutionally. I think the big challenge with the left and with the Dems specifically is this question of whether we're gonna be a membership movement and party, or we're going to be a centralized management movement and party. Theda Skocpol has written in the great book Diminished Democracy that over the last 50 years there's been a transition from participatory membership organizations to centralized management organizations. You would meet up in local chapters 50 years ago to fight for political causes. You would federate up into national organizations, whether it's through unions or parties or just cause organizations, and they would actually have the legitimacy and the power to move a bunch of people in a local area. That's transitioned to the major way we interact with politics is we consume media, we get angry, we send checks, they spend that on lobbyists and more marketing to get us angry to, consume media and send checks. And the big challenge is, are we gonna be able to do the more powerful institutional move, which is try to redevelop a participatory membership culture? Ideologically, the big challenge, I think, for the Dems and the big question is, are we going to have a hodgepodge ideology or are we going to have a strong unified vision? The current dominant ideology among the Dems is that the sign outside of my liberal suburban house, neighborhood houses, which is in this house we believe, and then the 7 constituencies of the Democratic Party, often listed in terms of reacting to the other side's attacks on our 7 constituencies and saying what we will stand for against those attacks. That might, hold your minority coalition together of like 40% of the country, but if you really want a permanent majority that can make big structural change, we need to have a unified vision. And so the big challenge is, are we gonna be, science is real and no human is illegal and Black Lives Matter, all of those causes I deeply care about, but you can't have a laundry list be a compelling unifying vision. You have to tie it together into something. I believe that we should tie it together into a deep vision of deepening democracy. More power to more people in more ways, freedom, not just as liberty, but as participation in power, as Martin Luther King said. Each of us co-creating our shared world. And I think you can weave each of those constituency causes into that, but it can have as compelling of a unifying vision as the right has, which is, liberty or tradition or, any of these big giant value causes. Third issue is, how are we going to fight the culture war? There's this shallow culture war going on, which makes our presidential elections incredibly stupid, and we spend valuable real estate of the public consciousness talking about Target Corp's seasonal displays, and my big challenge is, I'm not one of these people that believes the left should give up on defending and protecting the people that we're defending and protecting in fighting that culture war. But I think the way to overcome that culture war, which is sucking up a lot of energy and attention in our country, is deepen the culture war and actually go towards the deeper cultural questions. Not what's Target's seasonal display gonna be, but why has our public sphere's main venue become Target's seasonal display instead of a shared commons? Why are we so socially isolated that has led people to feel like why are we so mediated by screens? We need to start speaking to those deeper cultural questions, which I believe the ultimate culture war is not traditionalism versus modernism, which is the shallow culture war. I think the deeper culture war is, are we gonna be a techno-corporate, hyper-individualist society that says everyone's on their own, mediated through screens and corporations? Or are we gonna be a community, like a beloved community, mediated through democracy and shared public commons and the Commonwealth? Final question is our question of our leadership class of the progressive movement and the Dems. Our leadership class is graying, it is lacking in courage, it is lacking in verve, it is lacking in charisma. You wonder, oh, this is the leadership class, and you look at them and you go, that's not one of the top 1,000 Americans. We should have, you should look at a senator and you should say, oh, I get why they're a senator. They should be one of the 1,000 most compelling people. And why is our leadership class lacking in courage, lacking in creativity, lacking in verve? And that's going to be a challenge, which is how do we make up our leadership class? My big challenge, solution towards that is we need alternative and varied meritocracies. We can't just have the meritocracy that's, Yale to political internships to you're a senator. It has to be, there has to be other meritocracies as well. There are some virtues and many vices of the current meritocracy, but there's interesting meritocracies created by ascending through sports or ascending through celebrity, or even, they say academia is in the current meritocracy, but even having more scholars in the leadership class might even be interesting. Or rebuilding the membership organizations that raise up leaders outside of our white collar government. That's a great book called White Collar Government that talks about how most people in Congress and in the agencies haven't ever worked a working class job. The way you'd raise up a leadership class is you'd have unions, and then the top of the union would be the type of person who might run for Senate. And we got to raise that up too. And so I think those are the 3 questions. Institutionally, are we going to be membership or management? Culturally, are we going to fight the shallow culture war or the deep culture war? Ideologically, are we going to have a unified vision or hodgepodge vision? And in terms of leadership, are we going to just keep churning out more McKinsey consultants, or are we going to actually have a range of different people who have other virtues and vices that come from other meritocracies? And so I'm just putting all those pieces on the table, and I'm sure there's deeper questions and deeper rivers we can go down on each of
Well,
those.
Pete, whichever of those meritocracies you personally identify with, I personally view you as one of the top 1,000. Shadi, Pete's opened us with some questions that I did not realize that they actually go into some of the questions of your work as well, too, pretty deeply. So let me just ask you again the same questions, and I'm fascinated to see where this will go on the frameworks of liberalism, democracy, and everything else. What is the future of the American left? What are the most important philosophical divisions inside the American left? And what are the most compelling questions the American left needs to answer in the 2020s?
Yeah, great. Well, first of all, thanks, Luke, and thanks to Braver Angels for having me. Looking forward to this conversation. Okay, so I'm a little bit of a weird choice for this panel, I think, in the sense that I think I've changed over the past couple years. I've always considered myself of the left, and I still am, I think. I'm pretty sure I still am center left, but I think something's changing in my own approach. I don't ever plan to vote for the Republican Party and kind of go over to that side, but I think that I've become increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the Democratic Party. But I think I've made a conscious decision that I'm gonna fight from within. It might be a losing battle, but I don't think the solution is to leave and to join, well, there's only one other party we can choose from, so like maybe if we were in a multi-party parliamentary democracy, there would be like 6 or 7 other options, and one of them would be more appropriate for me. So I'm kind of stuck with the Democratic Party. And I think there's more and more people like me. And there's also been, I think, a lot of coverage about this. I think especially when we talk about Hispanics, Arabs, Muslims, Black men to a lesser degree, immigrants, children of immigrants, the Democratic Party isn't really appealing to them as much as it could, and it's in fact doing quite the opposite in certain issues, which is alienating them. And there was that excellent piece that probably some of you read in Atlantic last year by Tim Alberta about how the Democratic Party is losing Hispanics. And the numbers that we have on Muslims is that about 10 to 15% of Muslims in 2016 voted for Donald Trump. In 2020, the data we have isn't great, but it seems to be as high as 35%, at least based on some of the exit polling after the fact. But even if it was just 25% or 20, that would still be a significant increase. So I've just been thinking about how did we end up here? Why did we end up here? And if I feel that the Democratic Party is losing me, then to what extent is this being replicated throughout the country with people who don't want to say it? You know, I'm comfortable sort of sharing my unpopular beliefs, and they all have to do with culture. So this will bring us in a moment to the culture war. I'm economically on the left, but I don't really see the Democratic Party as focusing on that or being fundamentally about those kinds of concerns. I see it primarily as a cultural force. And I think it was the left, I would say, won the culture war so resoundingly that they became overconfident, and instead of being magnanimous in their victory, they decided to be uncompromising in their victory. And now a backlash is developing in response to what seems like an overwhelming victory. And not everyone's comfortable with that overwhelming victory. It's a victory that is concentrated in mainstream institutions. So whether that's academia, mainstream media outlets, corporations, technology firms, and so forth, there is a kind of just, left-wing drift on a deeper set of cultural questions that we weren't really thinking about in the same way as recently as 10 years ago. So something has changed very quickly. So the question is, what is all of this going to mean? Can the Democratic Party, instead of limiting its appeal culturally to a very small group of people and being very out of touch with where I think America is going and where a growing number of Americans want to go, I think that's going to be one of the key questions. So part of the issue here is that highly educated white liberals have been disastrous for the Democratic Party on culture. They're just really bad on these issues, and they don't represent the country. We can get into that later if anyone wants to. But I do want to make, though, a broader point about what it means to be, like, what does it mean to be on the left? We use that term. So I worked on the Bernie campaign, primarily on foreign policy, so I wasn't on the domestic side, but I was a Bernie supporter. I wanted him to win, and I saw myself as being of that, of at least being close to that world. And I had this idea that Bernie was one of the last kind of old school leftists who was resisting on the crazy woke stuff. But even he, I think, had to play into that and accept some of this new cultural discourse, and that's unfortunate. It wasn't always like that. So this gets to, I think, really foundational questions around the role of faith, ideology, identity, because part of the issue when we look at Hispanics and certain other minority groups is they tend to be disproportionately Christian, at least compared to white liberals, but everyone is disproportionately Christian compared to white liberals, so there's also that. But when we're talking about the groups that I had mentioned earlier, they do tend to be more socially conservative, and part of that has to do with their faith traditions. Is the Democratic Party going to find a way to be accepting of people who have orthodox theological commitments? And where Democrats used to seem like really open to Muslims, my own minority group, I think we were only really accepted insofar as we were Muslims as, so are we Muslims as a marginalized group? Is it like more of like an ethnic identity, or are we Muslim because we are religiously Muslim, which has theological implications? And I think what we've largely been seen as just like one of the core members of the Democratic constituency, the patchwork of 7 or 8 identity groups. And because we're marginalized, that's what makes us a minority, instead of the fact that Muslims are Muslims for like deeper reasons. So I think, what does it mean to be a minority, and what parts of our minority identity is the Democratic Party willing to accept? And can it find room to bring people in who on the key issues, or they're not really, I don't know, are they key issues, but they're important issues of, of things like abortion, and of course we can talk about gender identity, which I feel like is the breaking point for a lot of folks in the Muslim community, and I've been hearing that more and more, is that like we were willing to go along with pretty much anything up until now, but we got to draw the line somewhere.
Well, it's interesting because both of you have critiqued what one would think of as the quote mainstream left approach to culture war questions, but from very different sides of it. And both of you have argued that focus on a return to focus on either questions of direct political economy or a deeper version of culture war than the one that's currently fought would be preferable. And Shadi, I actually didn't know that you had worked for Bernie, so that goes a full way there. I'm just wondering what you two see as actually, to preface this, first question, is it possible for there to be real good old-fashioned socialist movements in America, in the American left nowadays? I hear a lot of people complaining that anybody who's an actual socialist on the American left basically is framed right-wing because there's no particular way to be deeply in that tradition in the version one. I don't know if that's true or not, but I hear that critique a lot. And so I'm wondering what you think of the relationship of the current relation of culture war questions, how it's addressed to that level of activist organizing. Second off, associated with that, assuming that there isn't going to be a major socialist bloc in the Democratic Party and the American left the way there was in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, what would an alternative approach to bread and butter democracy increasing and less deeply kind of media-centric democratic politics look like? Are there examples of that we can point to? Does it happen inside the Democratic Party or does it happen outside of it? I'm curious what you guys think about this.
Yeah, I'll say something on just the culture. Should I say something on culture war first? I don't buy the terms that the media and the reactionary side of the culture war want to set. I don't want to accept the terms because we know, Chris Rufo admits to it. They think up things that work and they throw spaghetti against the wall, and then they say, oh, this seemed to pop in Loudoun County, and let's see if we can bring that national, and then they use it as a political strategy. The deep culture war that's really going on, if I ask myself, if I ask any American, what's really going on and what are you worried about for your kids in terms of culture? It's not about random trans kids sitting in, beloved random trans kids in random parts of the country. It's about the fact that we're addicted to our phones and it's pulling us away from community. It's about that having and developing a personal brand has become the journey of our, the life journey now, and like the aspiration. They recently did polling of college freshmen, and the amount of people that said they wanted to be a patriot or they wanted to be a family person is way down, and the amount of people that said money is the most important thing to value in life is way up. It's the real villain of, when you look at these declining church numbers and membership numbers and people want to know why aren't people coming to the mosque or the synagogue or the church anymore, it must be those trans kids. The real culprit is the phone and the shopping mall and the policies that have made it, and the culture in the professional managerial class that says keep your options open instead of commit to particular things. It's the fact that we've built an economy that says when you're committed to particular things, we're not going to support you because the highest value is profit. Those are the deep aspects of what's happening in people's lives. It's not random 1% of the country that are edge cases in trying to have fight for their own dignity, to have their journey of their own life be accepted in their communities. Those are scapegoats, and it's scapegoating by the other side. So I just don't buy the terms of that. And I'm ready to fight the deeper culture war, which is how can we rebuild community? How can we get people back to congregations? How can we get people feeling a sense of local patriotism, loving their cities and feeling like they're parts of them, their cities and states, and putting in 10 hours a week again in civic life? How can we get people to develop the virtues again of loyalty and duty and responsibility and patience, all those wonderful conservative things? But I find, Chris Rufo and Ron DeSantis to be some of the most libertine people in America today. They're postmodern libertines. They're not conservatives. Conservatives are the union leaders that are bringing soup to people when they're sick. They're football coaches. They're pastors that are random Presbyterian pastors in random towns that are, trying to keep their congregations afloat. It's not people that are going on YouTube trying to get likes and clicks by, scapegoating someone. When it comes to, I guess that's my culture war take. I don't want to just lob on another one on economics, but should I save economics and socialism for
Actually,
next
I'm
runner
curious
up?
what Shadi thinks about everything you just said here too. But
So this is good. I actually like this because I think we have quite a different theory of the case here. And I guess that's part of what Braver Angels encourages.
I won't rule on reality, is the thing. So.
Okay, so Pete, I totally take your point. Questions of virtues, social trust, community, these are all things that we need to rebuild. We have to move away from an atomized society where it's each individual on their own. But I don't see how we can talk about virtues and community without talking about tradition, faith, and organized religion.
Amen.
And the Democratic Party is not hospitable to communities of faith. That is the bottom line. And we're like, so you still have Black Christians, you still have the preponderance of Muslims, and still within the Democratic Party. But the question is, are they staying in the Democratic Party because of the Democratic Party's position on culture issues, or in spite of them?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that if this continues, we're going to test that proposition. And this goes back to my point about, so it's not about, not even sure if I really mentioned the word trans. I said gender identity. So I think it is actually a bit of a distraction to talk about this in a narrow sense of the 1% of the American population that may be trans, and it gets to, I think, a much more fundamental question about like one's ontology, one's orientation to the world. And this is why the trans issue is a proxy to foundational questions about how we perceive reality, and also what we think is immutable in terms of things that have been taken for granted for a very long time, just basic propositions around gender and sexuality that are now being questioned for the first time in American history and human history and so forth. That's pretty foundational, and if it affects how you raise your kids, if it affects public education in your local school board, you are going to take that really personally. And I think anecdotally and also empirically, the evidence is growing, is that for a growing number of Americans, this is going to be a touchstone. And it's only because the Republican Party sucks so much and is so out of its mind that Democrats can get away with being terrible on these issues and still winning elections. What happens when the Republican Party actually becomes more sane, less crazy, and actually modulates on some issues and actually makes a real play for more folks in minority communities around some of these questions? Will the Democratic Party be able to hold the line, or will the Democratic Party start to move into a kind of more minority status? And I don't want that to happen. I want the Democratic Party to win, and that's why I think we have to push back internally on saying, fine, you can have your views on gender identity, but just make space for people who don't share your view. Be inclusive. The Democrats always talk about being inclusive. Why aren't they inclusive of people with traditional views on gender? Why can't those people be included in the Democratic Party? So I'm all for inclusion, but it shouldn't be a selective inclusion.
Pete, to what degree do you think the model of fighting the real culture war, as you put it, is compatible with the old expanded Rainbow Coalition idea all the way back to Bobby Kennedy and Jesse Jackson days, that includes both the traditionally minded either white working class or immigrant diasporas alongside other the different activist communities and the different groups that are historically thought of as being in a coalition? To what degree is there a synthesis in a?
Yeah. First I'll say, and I'll get to that one second. First I'll say, I totally agree, and I'm not going to stand here and defend. I'm a man of the left. I'm a member of the Democratic Party. I'm a member of my local Dems, but I'm not going to stand here and kind of be a spokesman for the Dems. And I totally agree with you on the kind of analysis that you don't need too much loss to become a permanent minority party. If the Republican Party shaves off 10% of the Black or Hispanic vote, it's over, game over. It's not that it needs to go from 90% to 40%, it just needs to go to 75%, and there's not a Democratic president again. And so, these questions of the 15% of people that are gonna be shaved off of the groups, and the coalition of the Democratic Party is mostly all professional managerial class folks, and then working class folks of color. Those are the mix. The people in the driver's seat of the Democratic Party making decisions unfairly and unjustly are just usually the white professional managerial class folks. And that creates horrible coalitional dynamics where, the spokesmen are very condescending to half the party and all these things. One thing I'd like to just, on party dynamics, I just want to say is, this is what we're seeing on TV a lot, the professional managerial class talking on MSNBC, but, there are, I would reckon, the vast majority of Democratic Congress people are religious. The vast majority of Democratic committee chairs at the local level are religious. You go to any liberal Protestant church, they're all Dems. The lingering Presbyterians and Methodists, the Reformed Jews that are going to Senate, they're all Dems. So I don't think this is a story of, I think it's a story of what we're seeing in the media a lot too, but I'm not denying.
One pro-life Democratic congressman now?
There are some cultural issues that have become litmus tests, and that is true. And I will not deny that something as deep as abortion has become something that I think goes deeper than what I'm calling the shallow culture war. I don't think Chris Rufo thought up the pro-life movement, and that is a truly big
if he were to take credit for that, I'm sure we could have a whole lot of
and so that is one area that I think does cut deeper. The question of can we have the Rainbow Coalition and still be part of this deeper communitarian stuff I'm talking about, I think that is the exact way that we have the Rainbow Coalition, which is, I think, cultural conservatism, small c, Burkean conservatism, that believes in virtues, that believes in what E.J. Dionne writes about in Washington Post op-eds, that is, kind of milquetoast, civic, mid-century virtues of, participate in your community, be part of a local congregation, have a little bit of, have faith in something transcendent that guides you, but not go overboard into fundamentalism, super fundamentalism that divides you, neighborliness, take up your responsibilities of care for your parents and your children and your neighbors and others in your family that you care about, and what Robert Putnam calls our kids, all the kids in town, not just your kids. That is the type of Friday Night Lights conservatism that gay people are into, trans people are into, black people are into, Hispanic people are into, Asian people are into, white people are into, old people are into, young people are into, and I think that's the thing that could unify it. But unfortunately, the Ron DeSantis's and Nikki Haley's and Donald Trump's and Chris Rufo's of the world are not talking about that. I wish they would. I wish we had a revival of cultural conservatism, which, another way I'm kind of trolling when I call it cultural conservatism, communitarianism, the real practical, on-the-ground, personalist relations of duty and responsibility and care, I think, are the things that could unify across
Can I add one thing to this that hasn't come up yet? I think it's important when we talk about these deeper values questions is how do we orient ourselves towards the American idea? How do we feel about America, the founding? Are we proud to be American? And just before this, I just wanted to make sure I was up to speed on some of the numbers, because I knew that they were sort of hard to believe, so I just wanted to make sure I wasn't imagining this. So this is a Gallup survey that in 2004, 91% of Americans said that they were either extremely proud or very proud to be American. In 2020, that number dropped down to 63%, a massive drop. But the catch is, the vast majority of that drop is concentrated among Democrats and liberals, and the numbers here are just incredible. In 2020, 67% of Republicans said that they were extremely proud to be American. Only 24% of Democrats in 2020 said they were extremely proud to be American. That is going to be another big problem, and it gets into, again, the question of immigrants. The people, at least in my experience, who tend to be pretty proud to be American and very thankful that they're here because they've seen the alternative. Their parents maybe lived under authoritarian regimes such as my parents. The idea that we would treat the American founding as something to be ashamed of, to kind of talk about some kind of inherent evil in the American idea, that is tied to these bigger questions of building community. Because if we're saying that we don't even share a common sense of being American, that we want to actually, kind of rethink the entire narrative of what it means to be American, how is that going to work? How is that going to be able to build a majority support in the Democratic Party?
In fairness to the, what would it be, the 37% of Democrats that have, or the 37% of Americans, largely Democrats and liberals, who have ceased to check that box on the polls, I do think that just anecdotally speaking, the vast majority of people who are professional managerial class, white liberals who have a vast conspiracy to control the cultural output of the American left and the Democratic Party, I think at some level, if you like, and I'm just thinking anecdotally about my own friends and about like observing civic life and other things like that, they won't wrap themselves in the flag, they won't even fly the flag, and they won't go actively say, yes, I love America. I really love America and would like to go have a barbecue. Like, they probably won't do that. But in terms of every other indicator of how often they vote, how often they go relate to figures in the recent American past, how often they say these issues are important to me, X issues are important to me. They might be wrong about all of those or none of those or anything, but on all other levels of functional patriotism, except identifying as loving America, I feel like the majority of liberals who will go down.
But sorry, Luke, that's a very important part.
Yeah.
Patriotism is not functional. It's maybe partly functional. I personally don't think of patriotism in that way.
Mhm.
Patriotism is about ideas. It's about commitments. It is about love. It is about pride. So, like, without those things, that to me is not patriotism.
Mhm.
That's just my view.
I feel, I don't want to play the blame game on this, but a leadership class in the 2000s was in charge of stewarding the the idea of the flag and American patriotism, and they gravely misused it. In a horrible, epic, historic fashion, they basically, after 9/11, at the high point probably of American patriotism since like VJ Day, they used Americans' institutional trust and love of country, and deeply misused it, and we have not even processed as a country how gravely they misused it. And your job, what we are all called to be if we're the leader of a community and something as big as a national community, is stewardship. And stewardship is you inherit a precious inheritance. And I'm like quoting from conservatives here. You inherit a precious inheritance, you hold it and you keep it alive and you pass it on to the next generation. And if someone did pass it on to the next generation because they used all the patriotic capital to do two disastrous wars that have left horrible scars across the world and in our own country, that's a disastrous thing that a leadership class did. So now the second part of stewardship is you have to you steward something not like a vase, like behind glass. You steward something like a living being, like a flower, and you have to constantly be re-upping like the meaning of that thing. And so the project of rebuilding patriotism is not like finger wagging at the people who are saying they're not patriotic. It's sparking that spirit again. And many times throughout our history, we've rewritten the history of this country. The whole reason there's a Jefferson cult is because FDR got really into it to help, FDR got really into Jefferson and tried to like talk about him a lot. There are presidents that, everyone talked about Grover Cleveland for a long time and said he's one of the founders we have to like look up to. And then Grover Cleveland dropped out. Things before 1776 were part of American history, and then suddenly we said, oh, let's start thinking about 1776. So I think Barack Obama had it right on this, which is he said the way to fight the like history wars was not to like just do cancellations, but to do an opening up of more historic figures. And so, I love what Michael Lind says, like Frederick Douglass should be our George Washington. He's the most American, better than a billionaire, like land speculator. Instead someone who fought for their own freedom and then like opened up their heart to even other freedom causes and, mixed all these different American values that are relevant today. And so we, in some ways you could think of the work of renaming things and finding new statues to put up and coming up with more historic figures to look to, is a project of saving America, you know, because the alternative is don't care about America anymore. If people are fighting over our history, it's because they care about it.
As a Michael Lind reading Unreconstructed Hamiltonian Federalist myself, I am fully down canceling Thomas Jefferson as much as everybody else is. I'm curious on another front, and this goes back to the socialism question, but I feel like there's some threads on the nature of patriotism, the nature of civil religion, the nature of trust, and the nature of national identity that we won't have nearly enough time to go through in the next 20 minutes. And I would love to continue that conversation with you two over the next years and decades if you want, because there's many things to do there. But I do want to nail back real quick to the initial purpose of this conversation in questions of political economy. So let's go back to the question, is it possible to be a democratic socialist in today's American left in any meaningful sense? And is it possible to have a broad reorientation towards a tangible political economy as the focus of what gets voters to the polls in an economic ideology sense? Not just say like, oh, people will automatically vote this way or that depending on what the interest rates are. That's the most important thing. Like, what's the creative vision of economics? My fellow conservatives are always neurotically thinking about what the new version of libertarianism should be. And I feel like at some level, I'm just kind of curious to what degree is like, are these people who are saying state capacity and supply side progressivism, are they pushing anything like that? Is that something that can be anything resembling a feet on the ground grassroots thing, or is that something that's fundamentally reserved to policy wonks and technocrats? And if we do approach an America where Pete, to use some of your frames, we have a return to commitment and a revolt against freedom in some sense, right? If you have that, if you have this new communitarian thing on both right and left, Shadi has argued that the rise of economic nationalism on the right and the standard economic liberalism on the left has actually inflamed the mid-level hot-button culture issues of the dumb side of the culture war rather than the strong side of the culture war. And so I've never actually really thought that through, but I'm curious what you two think about both the possibility of a left syndicalist politics, or a left anarchist politics, or a left socialist politics, or even a left just new everything, and then what are the consequences of that, should that be possible for other things?
Okay, I guess I'd start. Yeah, so that was the thing that I thought was really compelling about Bernie. And unfortunately, I don't think there are a lot of successors to that vision and that orientation in the Democratic Party. And it almost feels like Bernie was the last of a particular kind. And he would invest economic questions with a kind of deep abiding sense of morality. It was like a moral cause. It was about meaning. It wasn't about technocracy or tinkering around the margins or passing discrete pieces of legislation. He would speak in a way about economic grievances that really could bring in a lot of people, and that's why there was a portion of so-called white working class voters or Trump curious voters who actually also found Bernie compelling, because even if he did occasionally talk about the woke stuff, you could tell his heart wasn't in it. You could see what drove him, what animated him, what he cared about, and the way that he spoke about it was compelling. And this brings me to, I suppose, you mentioned earlier the friend-enemy distinction, which is something I think about a lot. The work of Carl Schmitt is that politics is, in the end, about conflict between friends and enemies. And the challenge for us is to try to figure out, if we're gonna have enemies, let's make sure we have them in the least destructive way possible. So instead of making minorities into an enemy, whether it's Hispanics, Muslims, immigrants, and so forth, the better way to talk about enemies is the 0.1%. That was like Bernie's very smart innovation. He took a Schmittian premise and directed it in a way that wasn't going to tear the country apart. Because it is legitimate to be angry at the 1% or the 0.1 or whatever it happens to be, billionaires. And that was actually like a very smart approach, a smart framing that generally speaking the Democratic Party isn't super comfortable with. So it's that kind of economics of meaning, that kind of moral outrage about economic disparities that I think does have a broad audience. But the problem, as you mentioned, I've written about this in my work, in a piece called, if anyone wants to read the full argument, for the Forever Culture War in Atlantic, where I argue that because the Republican Party has actually moderated on economic issues, they've moved in a more economically nationalist or even economically populist direction, especially intellectually. If you look at some of the rising stars in the Republican Party, people like Josh Hawley, whatever you think about him, but they are at least doing some economically populist things. And that means, in the libertarian wing of the Republican Party, has really dissipated. It's hard to find libertarians who are like, that's not where the heart of the Republican Party is intellectually. So what that means is that there's a kind of populist convergence, and that means that if there isn't as much to distinguish the parties on the big economic questions like trade, and then what do you have left? Culture. And you have to distinguish yourself from the other party. And if you don't have an easy way to distinguish yourself on economic grounds, then the easy low-hanging fruit is going to be culture war.
I have a schema of the kind of menagerie of like growing economic. Can I allow a schema?
Yeah.
Okay, just a little like categorization of all of them. So, basically, I think we've been in like the chains of like neoliberalism and laissez-faire economics for 30 years, and the chains are coming off, and basically all these new ideas are popping up. And here's how I see the ideas. Basically, there's on the demand side, there's two big worlds. One is like the old guard, the economic security, social democracy folks who are fighting basically to, on one end, like UBI, upwards towards public goods and Medicare for all, anything about just the state stepping in and providing economic security. The second side, on the demand side, is labor power and rights. So that's the rise of the new unionism, and if you can't get it through a union contract negotiation, you can get it through like a city passing a worker rights ordinance. Then we got on the supply side a rise of a few different creatures of ideology. So one is we have this new, like the new abundance, the new supply side. I think they're kind of like the successor to the millennial neoliberals who are basically, we need more housing, we need more semiconductor chips, we need more nuclear power. Usually the method they do is deregulation still, which makes why I think it's like neoliberals like YIMBYs. But occasionally they say the state should step in and help with, increasing that supply. Another side of I think the most fruitful side where you're seeing like a lot of action is the antitrust side, which is is beyond just like using antitrust to break up, big orgs. It's also all of the kind of corporate scrutiny that Warren is doing. It's all of in the law schools, this movement called Law and Political Economy. It's like on fire with young lefty lawyers that's challenging law and economics, and all those people are going to ascend into being staffers and agency folks, and they're all thinking about how do we structure corporations and how like the corporate form as a thing, and getting into the institutional questions of how does dog grooming work in the US and how is it structured with student loans? How does agricultural tools work in the US, going industry by industry like Ralph Nader in the 70s, kind of the neo-Brandeisian, it's sometimes called, looking at these kind of corporate forms. Then I think you get these three really interesting vanguard movements. Like there's a growing public enterprise movement. There's a group that just got started called the Center for Public Enterprise. A lot of interest among young lefty wonks around public banks. Public housing developer is going to pass in Rhode Island, and we're going to have a public housing developer. A lot of public pharma has passed in California, and getting the state back into doing enterprise. The other, I'm really interested always, I'm always holding on hope for this movement because it's kind of the displace capitalism movement, which not, fight capitalism, but displace it, which is cooperatives, people trying to really grow from the ground up interesting new forms of production. And the way that I think we should all weave all of this together, and we're gonna discover which of these work best by democratic experimentalism. We gotta let all these experiments run and see what takes off and double down on what works. And one that I think isn't talked about enough, that I hope there's more action around, is what I call democratizing production, which is the major cause of inequality in the United States. There's intra-firm inequality, which is like the boss and the owners make more than you, which you need labor power for, and tax and transfer for. But the biggest inequality in America is inter-firm, which is in major hubs like New York and San Francisco and Austin or whatever, Boston. You have these vanguard industries where, lower members on the totem pole at those firms are making more than managers in places where there isn't vanguard firms. And so the answer to that is we have to, bring the idea of development domestically and think about what are the preconditions that allow for there to be, vanguard modes of production to bring the best practices of, high-tech, knowledge economy production to more places and more ways, so that we have more hubs, so that it's not just quarantined in these major cities. And that's beyond just like having computer labs there. It's not like let them eat code. It's thinking about how do you have, how do you have anchor universities like Stanford and MIT served to anchor like their industrial hubs? How do you have high social trust? How do you have buy-in from the cities and the states? How do you actually make sure that the best practices are being done? How do you democratize capital so that more people can start things out and grow them? How do you have public accelerators? All these institutional questions that development economists think about for other countries often, we need to think about for here. And a lot of it's going to involve all those other different creatures of that are rising up. So when people say, is socialism happening in the US? All those things are happening. They're all called socialists by like Ron DeSantis or something. And they're all interfighting with each other, thinking each other through the narcissism of small differences, thinking each other is like the actual enemy. But all of those are growing up at the same time, and I'm very excited about that.
As an acolyte of the Eugene Debs to Antonio Gramsci School of Conservatism, I know exactly who I'm talking about when I say socialist. It's not Obama. Anyways, we're going to go to audience questions in just 1 minute. So if you have any questions, please start getting them ready, and I'll do a show of hands in just a few minutes here. But I have one last question for both of you, and that is, what gives you any kind of hope about the coming times of any individuals, any movements, any thinkers, any just prospects for things that might happen in the next years in public life? Is there anything that gives you hope about the idea that there can be a very well productive and very internally useful to its own self and useful to America more broadly, American left and Democratic Party? What gives you hope about the future of that, if any?
I'll start with, I'm very excited. We're not seeing the union density graph turn yet, but we're seeing signs such as like if you polled people in 2005 on unions, it would be low, and now it's very, very high. And the fact that even people on the other side want to brand themselves as interested in kind of breaking from kind of neoliberal orthodoxy, I think that's really exciting. I think the interest in unions is really exciting. And I think the rise of, I think the rise of law and political economy in the law schools and in scholarship, which is, I think, is like a vanguard thing that's going to break out into like popular culture soon. That people are thinking about creative ways that we can organize the economy and getting creative and visionary again, and looking to different points in history again gives me a lot of hope. And then on the cultural side, I think the fact that Chris Murphy, a senator from Connecticut, is making his whole brand and theme as senator be, I want to fight social isolation. and kind of getting into the sociology of social isolation. And he just wrote an op-ed in the Daily Beast and was on Morning Joe talking to libs, boomer libs all across the country about we need a spiritual left and we need to tap into transcendent and communal aspects. And so I'm a big believer in the Wendell Berry idea that, in the dark of the moon, this is from his poem, February 4th, 1968, I believe it's called. In the dark of the moon, in the dead of winter, war spreading, people dying, I walk the rocky hillside sowing clover. And, I'm really into the idea that these tiny sowings of clover in the rocky hillside of our time, you never know how quick they can grow and how quick they can spread. And we might be on the precipice of something much better, even though it seems on the surface like a really dark, rocky hillside. So,
Please send me that comment.
yes.
Appreciate that too. Shadi, anything else?
Yes, I share some of that optimism. I think there is growing attention to what I think are pretty fundamental questions right now: the crisis of meaning, belonging, loneliness, despair, mental health, depression. A lot, that is something that more and more people are focusing on. And as some of you know, the numbers are pretty, again, kind of hard to believe, but the CDC report that came out recently, 1 out of every 3 teenage American girls has contemplated suicide. Just very unusually high levels of depression, prolonged wait until marriage, declining, there's no reason this should be conservatively coded, but right as I was about to say it, I'm like, this is gonna sound like a right-wing thing, but declining fertility rates, there's no reason that should be a conservative talking point.
Among individuals.
So the question is, what are actually the policy changes that are going to address these things? How are they actually going to change? Because it is very hard to make people happier, to make people more content and satisfied. And some of it does need a focus on communitarian ideals. And I think that also the experience in Democratic-led cities, including right here in DC, I think everyone is reaching their natural limit. We all sense that something is fundamentally wrong with ourselves, with our own levels of happiness and social connection and social trust. But we also see evidence of social collapse every day when we walk in DC. And that's something that we haven't really mentioned explicitly: crime and homelessness. The fact that Democrats in major cities across the country refuse to actually address things that are fundamentally about who we are together. We shouldn't feel like we're living in cities where chaos reigns supreme, where rule of law is not enforced. These are things that all relate to the very important points that Pete raised. But there are reasons that Democratic mayors and Democratic district attorneys, at least in some cities, aren't willing to actually address these questions in a serious way. It does bring us a little bit back to culture, because if you have a particular view about human motivation and the relationship between culture and society, then you may not prioritize things like fighting crime or addressing homelessness because you don't want to be perceived as racist. A lot of these things are being coded in ways they should not be coded. So I think that I just wanted to put those issues on the table because I feel like it sort of goes unsaid, but we all know that's a pretty serious problem.
Could I ask a question about that though? What Republicans are fighting crime?
Well, crime is
what part of the Republican Party platform or any Republican individual leaders are fighting? I like Republicans across the country, but Republican leaders.
But I didn't say anything.
Are any of them working on fighting crime?
But why are we shifting the attention to Republicans? I'm talking about our own side.
But Democrats put forth a lot to fight crime. They put forth housing bills. They put forth raising the minimum wage. They put forth helping get kids lunch in school. They put forth policing. They put forth smart on crime policies that are the smartest sociology and psychology studies to do prosecution and criminology responses.
The smarter on crime experiments don't seem to be working as intended.
They're working great.
Great.
Eugene, Oregon is experimenting with alternate first responders. It's going great. There's places.
The major cities that Democrats actually control.
But not any more than any of the Republicans.
Republicans don't actually control many cities.
But in all the cities and states that they control, there's the same crime wave. It's economic. And we had a COVID, it's just...
When we're talking about crime and homelessness and this kind of confluence of developments in recent years, they are concentrated in major cities. And those are predominantly led by Democrats. There aren't actually a lot of major cities where you have Republican mayors and Republican city
I have a friend
councils.
who's homeless in my hometown, and he just got a job the Republican way of trying to get out of homelessness. He got a job at a grocery store. The grocery store has a rule, that's a corporate rule of Harris Teeter Grocery Store, that says if you have been charged with a crime, tough on crime, you can't start the job until you get this cleared and go through all this bureaucracy of rules. Then he, his arrest was because of overzealous policing, and it's preventing him from getting out of homelessness. So why do we assume that policing and prosecutions and tough on crime rhetoric is the source of solving crime?
I didn't say that's a source, but certainly defunding the police and that sort of move within a certain wing of the Democratic Party.
But during this crime wave, we've had an increase in police funding. So, where has there been a defunding of police?
This actually opens up some
Where has there been a defunding of police?
Yeah.
In this city.
Is that true?
Hey, we're gonna get to audience Q&A in just one moment here. We'll go to some things.
I mean, don't get me started on DC City Council, and thank God Mayor Bowser is pushing back against this craziness, but it took the mayor to actually...
Where is a Republican fighting crime? I'm just interested.
So this is something, remember, this is a conversation on the inside of the left, and something that, and sorry for intruding on a left conversation myself, but I do think this is something that just points to some of the questions of conflict. And questions of difference in social vision that I'm glad that you guys have given us many good tools for addressing. And I will actually, so I had mentioned the civil religion and patriotism identity question as the one that's most interesting to me. But I think particularly given that we live in Washington, D.C., given that we live in the nation's capital, and given that that this is like there's a presentness to this here. I would love to talk to you both about figuring out ways to think on this in future conversations. If you'd be interested. Okay. So this will actually be something quite interesting for many reasons, but because of the rambunctious energy in the room, I want to open this up to audience Q&A so that we actually get to do that for some. I don't think I'm going to get to everybody, but I'm going to get to as many people as I can before we stop. We'll go through at least 20 minutes, and we'll see as much as we can. So yes, Zoe.
Thank you.
And if everybody, okay, so 2 rules. Number 1, introduce yourself, let us know who you are. And number 2, please ask your question in the form of a question. And I promise you, you can take anything you say, anything you can possibly say, no matter how short or long, and make it into a question by asking at the end, and what does the panelists think about that? So, start us off, demonstrate.
My name is Zoe J. I've been out as queer and agender for over 10 years, and I'm a recent alum of American University that studied criminology in the city, and I think it's really interesting that we bring up crime as a point when you say the word crime, when I don't know if you're talking about violent crime, or person-to-person crime, or person-to-object crime, or inside like property crimes or anything like that. So what I'm asking is to build off this idea of, especially defunding police, you mentioned, which I appreciate, I do suicidality research and social work research about refunding social, like mental health crisis response teams, and basically addressing the fact that police have way too many jobs to do, and that we need to kind of divvy them up between multiple forces because cops can't do everything. They've shown us that they cannot do everything themselves. Do you think crime is one of the big issues that keeps us separate across the aisle? Or do you think it's sort of this culture war of saying we need to be tough on crime because crime bad, criminals awful, felons suck, that sort of ideology of culture war, like banning the box and things like that is countering it? Like is crime itself and the action of like criminal statistics the issue, or is it this issue of crime as a culture war object? And how does that go into the debates we're having about defunding the police?
Thank you.
I like the question. Ish.
I'll start by just saying I'm with Bobby Kennedy in that he wrote a lot about that violent crime and even property crime is a threat to community and social capital building in a town. And when you don't feel safe to go outside, you don't have a public space anymore. So it's very important to deal with that. That is a public problem that we have to deal with. The way Americans, one of the great American virtues, something I'm deeply proud of our country, that we beat Europe at, is we don't get mired in ideology, and instead we try to do democratic experimentalism to solve things. From the founders, Ben Franklin, let's try out firehouses, let's try out libraries, let's try out this type of club, the Junto Club, and let's see if it works. I believe, I sometimes have a joke that we have too many pragmatic Democrats, small p, pragmatic, large D Democrat, and not enough pragmatic Democrats, large P, pragmatic, small d Democrat, by which I mean the pragmatic process of bringing to bear social science and experience and experimentation to democratic experimentation to see what works to address public problems. And the way to address one of the public problems of crime is we need to run a series of different institutional models to see what works and double down on them. We need to bring to bear the best of psychology, anthropology, sociology, economics onto those questions. And we need to have kind of democratic processes where we have a lot of voices, so we make sure there aren't hidden costs to the different methods that we're using. And we need to free ourselves from a kind of a reactive ideology that says there's only one way to do this, which is just cops or just prosecutors or just prisons. And I think we've had, for the first time in the last 10 years, driven by red state Republicans being open to this, a return to pragmatic, smart on crime policies in a turn, and that's been an opening towards bringing to bear that kind of institutional innovation spirit. And I don't know why we would stop that when it doesn't seem connected at all with kind of the fact that we're lowering sentence lengths from 40 to 20. It's not resulting in there being more carburetors being stolen, from cars.
Shadi, same question. Is crime on the American left more a cultural question or more a social reality?
The problem is everything relates to culture now. And there's no way to get around it. So Pete's talking about bringing to bear kind of innovation and insights from psychology, anthropology, and so forth. But if we're looking at mainstream academia, there's no way to say that these psychologists and anthropologists and sociologists and criminologists aren't influenced by the cultural maximalist turn in university departments. I mean, that is something that has changed, and I don't want to get into like the DEI stuff, but we're talking about entrenched cultures in the kind of academic input into these debates. So if you're bringing in a whole kind of like army of sociologists and criminologists, it's not about what works anymore. It's about it's about presenting the right cultural indicators and not being morally offensive and not crossing certain red lines when it comes to cancellation and so forth. And there's a lot of survey data on how academics, but also Americans more generally, especially in mainstream institutions, aren't actually comfortable sharing when they diverge from this kind of new elite line on culture. So that just makes it very difficult to know what works. And this is why we see a lot of minimization of crime as a problem. I mean, the gaslighting is incredible, where many Democratic politicians, including certain district attorneys, will say things like, no, crime isn't actually worse. You're imagining that. Here's my in-house criminologist. He's run the numbers. Actually, crime isn't the problem you think it is. It's gaslighting people and telling them that what they see with their very own eyes is not true. I mean, Chesa Boudin would do this in San Francisco. He would tell people, no, crime is not a problem. But like, obviously we can tell crime is a problem. Now, you can mess with the statistics. So crime isn't as bad as it was in the 1990s or the 80s. But if you are an individual voter, you're not like, oh, well, at least the murder rate, it's up, but it's not as high it was as in 1992. Yay! No, you're gonna say, well, the murder rate is up compared to 2016. That's more recent. Like, why are we going back to 1990 and doing these longer comparisons? But the thing is, with statistics, you can always present the story in a particular way to support your preconceived conclusions. And that is what is happening increasingly, in these spaces. I mean, like minor crime, property crime, shoplifting in DC certainly has increased significantly in the last few years.
For the sake of getting as many more questions as we can, I'm going to rule out of order any further questions on crime. And hope that I'm not committing any particular crimes in theory. But let's take this gentleman in the front left.
Hi, how's it going? Do I have to stand?
Yeah, stand and say your name.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Matt. I like economics and data a lot. So I noticed in a lot of this discussion, it seemed like we were separating the economy and culture a lot as sort of like two distinct forces when, the one thing I always thought was kind of annoying in economics was we would say, oh, your demand curve is set by preferences. It's like, okay, but where do those come from? And I was wondering if you have any thoughts on, general economic precarity and inequality shaping people's cultural preferences now, in that people telling stories of how, the world makes sense in reaction to, material conditions. Do you think the display at Target has something to do with, middle class suburban people, wondering, oh God, we're actually kind of precarious and the economy's pushing in on us, and Democrats are also telling us that the stock market isn't the economy, but I know that's my retirement, as well as, yeah. But you get what I'm saying. I wanted to come up with another example from the left because there are a bunch, but that was just one that I thought of. So the interplay of cultural preferences into the economics. How do you think that shapes the actual part of the discussion?
Yeah, I'll just quickly. You can zoom in on any example. I won't touch on it, but crime as example has economic connections to it. But I'll just zoom in on one example that the people in law and political economy are great to talk about. Great person on this is like Stacy Mitchell at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. The structure of how we allow. How we structure corporations, how we allow monopolies to form, how we allow labor markets to form, how we design, if we're going to allow mergers or if we're going to allow private equity buyouts of things, is going to affect the culture of a community. So there's all these studies on what happens when Walmart moves into a community and what happens to Main Street, and you do find, as Walmart might argue, prices do go down, so on the one thing they were measuring, we got this benefit and everyone chose the lower prices, but then later, the kids' Little League team didn't have a sponsor, and there were 35 less civic leaders because all the Main Street shops shut down. And so there's all these kind of effects that happen. One other example, just to zoom in on, is labor unions are not just an economic story, they're also a cultural story. When you form a labor union, it creates new lines of solidarity. And it changes how people vote, it changes how people act as tenants, it changes how people act as members of the community and how they think about public problems. The Chicago Teachers Union strike wrote into their contract, I believe I'm getting the story right, they wrote into their contract getting more funding for parks because they had such a strong, supermajority strike that they wanted to start thinking about what do our students need with this contract. And so these structures, and as people in the kind of super vanguard cooperative stuff will tell you, the structure of a housing cooperative versus a corporate-owned, BlackRock-owned development, or a worker cooperative versus a large national chain is going to change the culture of Main Street. And so, let alone all the cultural changes and psychological changes that happen in individual people's lives when they're in less economic precarity. So I totally think it's like a seamless cloth.
Yeah, so I'll take this from a different perspective and I'll just be quick about it. I'll just share a first premise that I have that maybe went unstated earlier, but I don't believe human beings are primarily motivated by material interests. Mm-hmm. So that affects my entire sort of theory of the case. There are reasons why I think that about human beings, and that's a bit of a longer conversation. but I think it's also borne out by how people actually behave. People don't seem to vote their economic interest consistently across time and space. I mean, the right, even as economic inequality is ballooning across most major democracies, but also not very major democracies, yet the right wing, the cultural right, a right that is obsessed with culture war, is gaining ground most of the places you look, including places where you wouldn't think they'd have a lot of ground, like Sweden, for example, and Italy, where far-right parties with, at least in the case of Sweden, roots in neo-Nazism are as influential as they've ever been and part of the governing coalition and so forth. So we have to ask ourselves, why has the left, despite otherwise seemingly good conditions for like a class critique, why can't the left gain ground? This, I think, I don't have an answer for it, but it suggests to me that it's going to be like pretty difficult. And yeah, so if people are primarily motivated by non-material concerns, it puts the left in a precarious place. I don't know if that really answers your question, but it's one perspective.
There was a question in the very last row in the back. Is that the question still there?
But it was about crime.
That's all right.
Well, no, not crime, but like the concept of the carceral state. Does that count?
This is fascinating, and but it does in fact go back to crime, so I will in fact have to do it out of order. I'm sorry, come back to the next APF on crime sometime in the fall of 2023. We'll find out one of those two. Let's go to right in front of Jen. Dale.
Oh, yeah, I'm gonna go back to something from the very beginning. I'm Dale Brown. I'm part of the DC Alliance of Braver Angels. I've done a lot of work with intergenerational. But my question goes back to the very beginning of this, when you mentioned something about how we've changed from being sort of democratic organizations that started at the local level to these centralized organizations where we get notes from online.
Yeah.
Do you have any way or any thoughts about going back to those democratic organizations? Because personally, I find it really frustrating that I just get a bunch of emails and I'm expected to kind of obey.
Totally. I'm actually, the reason I was late today is I'm flying home we're on a documentary screening tour. We just made this documentary called Join or Die. This is a film. It's the opening line of the documentary is, this is a film about why you should join a club and why the fate of America may depend on it. If you go to joinordie.film, you can see where the screenings are. We'll have a DC screening probably in the fall. And you can host any screening with any clubs you have. And so I'm obsessed with this topic. Like I'm a Robert Putnam super fan. And it's, this is, when we made this movie, and it's about the history of how at mid-century, across every demographic group, all races, all genders, all generations, all parts of the country, there were higher levels of club membership. You can look at it in time diary data. We're literally spending less hours a week at meetings with our neighbors than we were 50 years ago. Across all types of clubs, the goofiest clubs, the bowling leagues, to the most serious clubs of political parties and activist groups and CORE and the NAACP and all the things fighting for causes. The answer, this is always like the lefty organizer answer. The answer is we just have to do the long and hard work of community organizing. We have to, there are people who do this. The union movement is working on rebuilding it. Jane McAlevey is the great writer on this. She has a great book called No Shortcuts. And it is a long slog that is one conversation at a time. They call them one-to-ones in community organizing. You gotta have your one-to-ones. Then you gotta identify your organic leaders. Then those organic leaders, the people you identify might be a good leader of the group, they have to have their one-to-ones, and then slowly over 6 years, you might have a good 50-person meeting once a week. Everything that needs to happen starts with every Thursday at 7 p.m. That, like, if it's not every Thursday at 7 p.m., it's not happening. Can I tell one anecdote about this? Just how important this is?
Go ahead.
If you read Martin Luther King's memoir of the Montgomery bus boycott, Stride Toward Freedom, great memoir, the first chapter is incredibly boring because all he is doing is describing all the clubs in Montgomery, Alabama in the 50s. He goes, there's this reverend and this reverend and this reverend, and then there's a club of all the reverends, then there's this all these women's clubs from the women's club movement at the turn of the century, and they have a women's club leadership conference, then the Bricklayers Union are giving us space, and inside of my own church, I have all these clubs inside of the church, club, organization, participants group. Rosa Parks, when she lights the spark, by the way, Rosa Parks, 10 years as secretary of the Montgomery, Alabama NAACP, a club that she devotedly went to once a week. When she lights the spark, all that tinder had already been gathered. So we're lighting sparks all the time on Twitter, and we're like, oh, I posted really hard and nothing went anywhere. It's because we haven't gathered the tinder. We need to start a 50-year project of gathering all the tinder. And you know, it doesn't mean we're only gonna start seeing results 50 years from now, but that's how long it's gonna take. And it starts all with, hey, do you wanna come to a meeting Thursday night at 7 p.m.? We meet every Thursday at 7 p.m. I hope you can join us. And I think that's behind a lot of these problems, and it's gonna be behind a lot of the solutions, more importantly.
Do you have anything else on that, Shadi? That much cool. All right, let's take a couple further questions. Jesse.
Okay. This
Jesse,
follows.
tell us who you are and where you're
Oh,
from.
Jesse Manistow. I live in Silver Spring, native of Detroit, Rust Belt, working class family. I have been involved in the left here, and I have a friend. I want to ask you: is she of the left, and if should she be on the? Is she and should she? Based on some things that both of you have said. So she and I, as part of a membership organization, have been really pumped about some of these things, like public banking and democratic control of capital, and a lot of stuff that Pete was talking about. But of course, that issue that Shadi brought up, she has an opinion about the gender issue that got her in trouble with some people on the left. And she kind of explained it, and it seemed like it was based on principles that used to be of the left, like sexism and stuff like that. Regardless, does she have a home on the left? Because she's being told by people on the left now that she's a conservative, and there are conservatives saying that, you know, there's the Eugene Debs brand of conservatism that you should consider.
Could you maybe say more about what the position was that kind of led to her being seen as a non-leftist?
Yeah, I mean, it's this, it's kind of the J.K. Rowling stance of, if you read her letter. So, yeah, she is.
Which you would describe as what?
The idea that girls are developing gender dysphoria because of, you know, sexist whatever. So she has a left articulation about it, whether people within the left agree or not. Should there be a space for that in the left? Is there, and should there be?
Well, easy answer. Of course, she's part of the left. Like, that doesn't disqualify you. That doesn't remove you outside of the fold. And this kind of like gender tech fear that's happening, I think, is kind of problematic. Like, in other words, excommunication in religions, and we're sort of applying the same rubric to political movements and making the tent smaller. It's an odd thing when you have a political movement and you're actually going out of your way to like remove people who like otherwise agree with you. Like, she sees herself that way, she self-identifies as a leftist, and she's actually participating in a leftist organization. That should be enough. But I will say, this is affected, like, I got in this like thing a few months back where Jonathan Chait described me as, in a piece that he wrote, as center-right, and I pushed back, and I was like, why, you know, and he did issue a kind of correction, but it was, anyway, but like, this idea that now a lot of people putting him aside, because we actually agree on some of the cultural stuff, me and Jonathan Chait, but like, I think more broadly, a growing number of folks on the left, or even center-left, would describe me as center-right, or not being on the left side of the spectrum because of my views on religion, gender, family, whatever it might be. Like, that's crazy to me. But you know what? Like, if they want to keep on pushing us out, like, they'll get what they're asking for. It's just not going to be good.
Pete, do you have any things on? Cool. Let's take one last question, and I will go to our friend in the blue here. Yes. Yeah. What's your name?
I'm Mira. I'm born and raised in Colorado. I consider myself a religious Jew. I'm also queer, but just covered a lot of bases here. Just kind of a bit of a follow-up on what you guys were just talking about. We talked a lot about inclusivity in general, and shrinking of the tent and enlarging of the tent and some typical more Republican speak in terms of those things. I'm just wondering how you see the changes in inclusivity and who we decide to consider leftists or in the left in general or not, and how that changes dependent on whether we consider people who come from trans identities and different gender identities as included if we're not going to include people who disagree with them, or if we should include those people and we don't kick them out of the tent supposedly, are we including them in our conversations? Are we then just having the exact same reaction on the other side of choosing to kick out people of different gender identities because we want the people who have been supportive of us for the longest time?
I appreciate this question because I think this boils down to the fundamental question of politics and identity's relationship to politics and the construction of groups. And I think this is something that I don't expect myself or Shadi or Pete to have a full answer to.
Okay.
But I'd be curious how all of us think about on this thing in particular, but also more broadly, just at the level of like, as a concept, how do you get people who have every reason to despise each other and to not see each other as existing to walk the same way on election day or in a political coalition or what? So I'm curious what you two think about.
Well, I think that to my knowledge, none of us are calling for trans people or queer people or non-binary people to not be included in leftist discussions or part of organizations. I have not heard that, so that's news to me if that's actually being advocated. It's the other way around. Like, this is also like the imbalance between woke and anti-woke. I'm more than happy to have woke people as part of the groups that I'm part of, the institutions that the clubs, whatever. The problem is woke people don't think there's space for me. That's why it's really hard to kind of come to like a reasonable conclusion on this stuff, because it's just like a fundamentally different approach to pluralism. When was the last time like a non-woke Democrat tried to fire woke people and like cancel them because they're like too woke? Like, we don't really do that because we believe in freedom of, people should have different views in the Democratic Party, so I would say trans people and whatever gender identity are part of the left, but then there should also be room for people who have the J.K. Rowling position. Like, I don't understand why those two people can't coexist in the same organization. They won't coexist if various folks say, oh, well, this person has the J.K. Rowling view, which used to be the standard position that everyone had for like centuries until like 3 years ago. So also, like, why is this being introduced as like the leftist position when it was never the leftist position for like the recorded history that we're aware of up until this point? It just doesn't make any logical sense. So basically, it's, I guess, intolerance of so the problem is if people who are quote unquote like hyper woke think that that's an intolerant position to have a traditional view of gender as it's been throughout human history, then they're gonna say, well, we shouldn't tolerate the intolerant. But by refusing to tolerate the intolerant, they're becoming intolerant.
As a Catholic who has read John Locke, I have been following this for a bit, and I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Pete, take us out on this too here.
I have a different view of this, which is we're deeply lacking. I think all of this. First off, I'll just say, like, this is an uncomfortable conversation that I almost think is like. Let me talk about it from the abstract first. We are lacking in this country in democracy and solidarity. And by democracy, I mean all of us, all of our neighbors, all of our beloved neighbors, all of our beloved kids co-creating our shared country together. That's the beautiful thing about this country that we can aspire to. And then solidarity is all of us getting connected to each other as real people. and actually caring about each other as real people in a personalist way. This is my Catholic side showing personalism, real people that have real needs. You know, the Jesuits invented casuistry. You might have all these ideals, you might have all these fundamentalist beliefs, but when you read a real person and you have a real hard situation, you defer to the love that you have for the real person. So I'm seeing that in this conversation, which is in the lack of democracy. You know, we're not trans people up here. I don't want to speak for any of us, but we're not trans people up here. And I think this conversation would be really different if there was someone here, up here, a beloved trans neighbor, a beloved trans kid here. And I think we'd all be talking about this differently if it wasn't mediated through ideas and screens and national politics, but rather mediated through the best way, which I personally think is a conservative virtue, which is mediated through real friendships and real rooms with real people. And that comes to the second part. With the democracy part, is letting people speak for themselves is where you really learn about the reality of the situation. The second thing is solidarity. The best way to solve, a thing that arises in social life that you are worried might threaten social life is to get closer to it, become more friends with it, reach out and meet real people. And anytime I run into someone who's, this person, that person, they're this, why are they doing this? Anytime we're using they in either direction, though, I sometimes feel uncomfortable comparing the two because more people face more consequences depending on which they you are. But I'll just say any they can be solved by becoming friends. And then once you have friends, you're gonna talk about your friends differently and you're gonna think about your friends differently. And I'm of the fundamental belief that friends love and care. I sound sappy in a PBS show or something, but friends love and care over, actually I'll say it deeper. It is my Christian belief that love, the love and especially the love of friendship overcomes often the rigid ideologies that divide us.
Well, we are running very, very short on time, and so now that we have firmly and finally and irrevocably resolved all of the future of the American left, you're about to clap, but when you clap, don't go away. I have a couple last announcements. Now that we've finally resolved all the questions of the American left, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us here tonight.
And let's hear it for Luke. Throw it.
Thank you, Pete, for giving us your time and giving us your thoughts and giving us your presence here in this important thing. So Braver Angels is committed to holding conversations across all political, cultural, and social divides in a variety of formats, and not just on things where there's a lot of common ground where we can actually find a policy solution or whatever on them, but on things where there's fundamental, deeply personal, down to the bone of what you are as a human being, divisions between people of goodwill and good faith, and demonstrate that it's possible to have those disagreements, even to have not just those conversations, but those arguments and those heated conflicts as happened here tonight, both with our panelists and myself and with the audience and the panelists and all of this, have those and be able to learn from them in a way that increases our ability to know that these conversations will not destroy America, they can in fact help build America into bigger things. That's what Braver Angels has been all about for as long as we've been, and as long as we're going. May we be struck down if we ever cease to do that, because all we hope to do is make that happen on multiple ways. So Shadi tonight and Pete tonight stood very firmly and very strongly for two very different understandings of what it means to be on the left, what it means to be a liberal. These are things that these perspectives and many, many more beyond them are of crucial importance to the large swath of America that is vaguely blue, and they will be continuing to be interesting and important for many years. And I just appreciate Shadi and Pete joining us and helping us do a little bit of this this wargaming and this exposition principle and this otherwise just helping figure out what things can be. So with that, Shadi, Pete, thank you for here. They have there's two QR codes on the back. One of those books is Shadi's book, The Problem of Democracy. The other of them is Pete's book, dedicated. If you do the phone thing and you hover over them, I strongly recommend you consider buying those books. I also strongly recommend you subscribe to Shadi's and Pete's Substacks. That's shadihamid.substack.com.
Wisdom of Crowds.
Wisdom of Crowds. Okay, I would strongly suggest you subscribe.
Wisdomofcrowds.live.
Wisdomofcrowds.live, excellent newsletter, does fascinating stuff. And then Pete has a Substack where all of his recent stuff comes out, and the Democracy Policy Network has a newsletter as well. So take a look at the Democracy Policy Network and do that. I just want to assure you all here that everything that you saw here, these are the kinds of conversations that we're going to be having on the America's Public Forum program and in every other debate series we do here in DC, all across the political aisle in many different spectrums and in many different disciplinary traditions. Nobody will be left out. Nobody is not worth talking to, and there's something that we kind of all learn from everybody. And on behalf of Braver Angels, I would like to welcome you to our community of friends. Invite you, should you be so interested, to consider having your organizations consider being friends of the Braver Network. I'll tell you about that. And all those of you who are interested in continuing to work with us on anything, come talk to me afterwards. I'd love to meet you. Subscribe to the Braver Angels newsletter so you can hear about us. And those of you who are interested in coming to the Braver Angels National Convention in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, July 6th through 8th. We still need a lot more Reds, and we still need a lot more young people, and I see at least a few of those around here, so if you're interested in those, please come around. But with that, Shadi, Pete, thank you. Everybody else, let's go forth and build a house united and figure out what the future of the left, right, and center, and everything in between might be.
Thank you.